Welcome to this episode of the Leadership Podcast, where our disagreements can fuel your decisions. I'm your first host for tonight, Brett Miller. I'm here with our other co-hosts, Dion Dixon, Thea Ali, and Will Atkins. Tonight, we're going to be going over the topic of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. A topic that's been kind of a hotspot for the country here in the last, well, I'd say a couple of years, really, but definitely here in the past few months, it's kind of reared up as one of those tension points. So we're going to roll through that tonight. Again, please, if you enjoy our conversations, like, subscribe, click on those, follow us, pass the word around. We'd love to also have your comments about any of our discussions. Please post those. We'd like to answer as much as we can. We want to involve our audience because we want to be able to bring people into these civil discussions and show people that it is possible that even as we are divided in some of our ideology, we can still come together as people and have civil discussions and talk through these things, because we believe that that's really the only way we're going to make progress. But for our topic of DEI tonight, I'm going to hand it over to Dion to start with. He's got a couple of definitions to roll through, because we believe that that is a point that is causing a lot of the tension, is that people don't agree on what DEI is, and they have differing viewpoints and coming from different angles. So we all want to kind of get on the same page to start with so that we can have a discussion around that. So Dion, what do you got for us?
All right. Well, I went ahead and pulled these definitions from dictionary.com, which I thought kind of more or less framed up what I think most of us are talking about when we say these things. So for DEI, it says a conceptual framework that promotes the fair treatment and full participation of all people, especially in the workplace, including populations who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination because of their background, identity, disability, etc. For diversity, it said the inclusion of individuals representing more than one national origin, color, religion, socioeconomic stratum, sexual orientation, etc. Equity, the policy or practice of accounting for the differences in each individual's starting point when pursuing a goal or achievement, and working to remove barriers to equal opportunity, as by providing support based on the unique needs of individual students or employees. And then finally, inclusion, the practice or policy of including and integrating all people and groups in activities, organizations, political processes, etc., especially those who are disadvantaged, have suffered discrimination, or are living with disabilities, i.e., our company is committed to addressing issues of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So that's what comes from dictionary.com.
Dion, that's so weird that the word quota never shows up anywhere in those definitions.
Is it?
That's so
there's
weird.
There's Will right out the gate with I guess a party's sort of view on what the other party is thinking, but fair point, right? Because I think a lot of the discussions over the past few years probably have revolved around things like quotas,
or the myth that DEI ever involved things like quotas. So, I think one thing to emphasize, or I think is important as far as if we're doing a baseline for this conversation, is to remind or to just state that DEI is not a new term for affirmative action, nor was it ever intended to be. And I think that my experience has been, when I have conversations with people about DEI, is that they will use that as a term, but they are describing what was once affirmative action. And that's fundamentally, I think, where a lot of the conflict comes in. And it's frustrating, though, because when we talk about like misinformation, I think it's disingenuous to equate the two. We could have a separate conversation about affirmative action, but again, at the end of the day, DEI was never meant to be or have the same goals as affirmative action did per se.
So, Thea, I'm not really familiar with when DEI kind of first came about and what the original intent behind it would have been. So if you have some of that, can you share it with us?
I wouldn't say that I'm an expert as far as the history of DEI, but I will say it's something that I've encountered in my legal practice. So my specialty is labor and employment. And in that, I've litigated a number of cases involving discrimination and different issues in the workplace. And so I also provide counseling to clients, normally corporate clients, of ways to try to address issues in the workplace. And I've done, workplace investigations. I've worked with very large companies of, trying to talk about their climate and, how did we get to this place where this litigation was happening. And when I came into the legal field, which would have been in 2018, the way that DEI was being used was really to address, okay, look at the workforce, look at, its makeup, look up. A lot of times we would always advise that a company do like a full, like a cultural assessment of their, of their workforce and see what feedback they get back from their employees. But quite often you would get negative feedback from different groups stating that they felt like they were disadvantaged or they were mistreated or there were certain policies in place that were hindering their ability to succeed within the company, right? And so a good example of that would be, sometimes dress codes, right? Dress codes were written in ways that, felt discriminatory to certain groups of people. I'll use my demographic as an example, right? So for a long time, this idea that with Black women who wore their hair in braids or had their hair in its natural state, that was considered unprofessional. So workplaces would have dress codes that would basically state that, Black women should have, or there would be things written in the dress code that would basically require like a Black woman to, adhere to European standards of beauty in order to present a professional appearance, And so like DEI programs, that was, there were a few different companies that I know of that, part of it was looking at, do our dress codes reinforce these types of biases, against particular groups of people? Are we doing things that are creating a barrier for somebody to be promoted within the company based on just their identity? And
So
so
Thea,
that's what it was supposed to address.
yeah, so sorry to interrupt, but I just want
Yeah.
to ask for a clarification here, because what you're describing sounds like something that was already technically illegal by the laws that we've already had for a while, right? That, like, anti-discrimination laws. So
Yeah.
it sounds like what you just described is essentially something that should have happened earlier and was
I
already
would say
covered by existing
yes.
law, or no?
Yes and no, right? So under Title VII, discrimination is going to be defined saying that somebody has suffered what's considered an adverse employment action because of their membership within a protective category or protected category. So under federal law, that would include their race, their gender, their race, gender, sex, and race, gender, sex tends to be the big ones, right? And so, and now we've read sex to include sexual orientation. And then sex would also include like pregnancy, right? So those are other things that fall under the umbrella. But the issue always had to be that there needed to be the adverse employment action, right? And it can be, it has to, you have to be able to show a but for cause, that but for the fact that you were a Black woman, you would have been able to, have this benefit of employment, or you wouldn't have suffered this adverse employment action. So a lot of times DEI, it was designed to kind of operate in the gray to try to train or address specific issues within a workforce. And I'm talking about in the workplace, not necessarily in schools. Obviously DEI has been in different, we see it come up in different areas, but it was not necessarily to say, okay, well, we have anti-discrimination laws, so therefore the problem's solved. It was designed to be a tool to say, okay, in spite of the fact that we have these laws, we're still running into problems, right? And it was based on an accepted understanding that people are different, and how can we allow people to come into these spaces as their whole selves and not feel that they're required to conform to a one standard norm in order to be successful, right? And so, and like I said, I'm describing a very idealistic, version of what DEI was supposed to be, but what it isn't and has never been, and I can tell you as a lawyer, at least on the corporate side, it's never been, oh, 89% of our workforce is white male, so we need to hire, 25% women so that we can balance out our workforce. Or we have no Asian workers in this sector, therefore we need to hire X number of Asian workers so that we can balance out the workforce and call ourselves more diverse. Those practices have, for a very long time, again, and that was what affirmative action was, right? And the Supreme Court struck down quotas decades ago. And so that's been illegal for years. And so that's where I think when you start talking about the way that DEI is being referenced now, that's where I kind of push back on that the courts had struck those down a long time ago, and that's not what the current iteration of these programs look like.
Well, where I've seen it most recently, there was the recent, I think it was the Harvard admissions case, right, that went to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And that was, they put that under the DEI umbrella. And then closer to home here, we have what used to be ranked the #1 public school in the nation, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, just down the road from me. And they are currently, that case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided not to hear it, but here in Virginia, the Attorney General is bringing up further charges about their admissions policies again, and this is being covered under the DEI umbrella. That, they looked at their student population, and before they changed their admissions policies, it was about 90% Asian in this magnet school for STEM. And they stated when they were changing their policies that they would like to see a more diverse student population. And then when they changed their admissions policies, all of a sudden that percentage of Asian students, I think, dropped to like 60%. And the Black and Hispanic student population grew. So, those are the ones that I'm most familiar with recently. I don't know about like corporate America hiring policies or promotion, that kind of thing, but those are kind of the two that really I came across most recently. So, but you're saying that like those kinds of quotas
the Harvard
have been illegal.
The Harvard case is referred to as an affirmative action case. That Supreme Court case is if you're talking about it in legal setting, people are not saying that that's a DEI case. That case is referred to as an affirmative action case because it was, and that's where I was saying like DEI is not the same necessarily as affirmative action. And so the way that the case law assessed that case, because that would be Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the case law, everything that was dealing with affirmative action. And so, and even then, Harvard wasn't saying they needed a certain, that it wasn't a quotas case. So let's start with that, right? But they're saying in that instance, the university was looking at it and noticing that, like you said, there wasn't diversity, or there seemed to be a lack of diversity amongst, students that were being admitted. And you had a very large, high percentage of Asian students that were being admitted. So they had taken actions to see, well, what can we do to increase diversity? And whether you agree with that or not, like I'm actually, as I was saying, I'm not sitting here and trying to make an argument for or against affirmative action when it comes to things like, school admissions. I'll make an argument for the academy in a heartbeat, because that's where we're seeing it now. And when I say the academies, for our listeners, the military academies, because even in that case, the Supreme Court did leave open, saying that in certain instances they can see why racial diversity would be like a compelling interest that a school would want to achieve in the case of the service academies. And as a graduate of the service academies, I have an opinion about that. But I don't know. I guess my whole point, I do think that
Go ahead,
as someone who served most of my career as one, I could always tell you how many Black female officers existed on every base that I ever was on. I do think that it's important if you're going to, but I could never tell you the reverse as far as how many Black female enlisted or how many Black enlisted total were on the base. There were too many to count and just be able to say, oh, this is how many of them there are. But I normally knew how many Black officers, but I always knew how many Black female officers there were because there were so few of us. And I think if you're going to have a force and lead the force and have a group of people that are leading enlisted troops, you do need to have some type of diversity in the officer corps. And I can't tell me how many times I had Black enlisted approach me for a myriad of issues that were not even necessarily under my supervision or command. And they came to me because they felt that I would be able to identify with different issues that they were going through. So I do think it's important to have diversity across the officer corps because esprit de corps is part of our mission and is part of leadership. And whether we like to admit it or not, there are issues that people are going to relate to or going to see and have a diversity of opinion and experience. Brett's talked about this a lot. Diversity is not necessarily just about race and demographics. It can be diversity of thought, diversity of background, but race does kind of play into that, So at least when we're talking about the military, I do think having an all-white or not even acknowledging the lack of diversity amongst officers, if we don't acknowledge it and we don't seek to address it, I think you open yourself up to a lot of problems within the enlisted corps and our leadership structure. But that's Thea's opinion.
So, Thea, just to kind of play upon that, obviously as the representative Republican, right? I want to kind of give the viewpoint of what most of the right would probably be around that. And I don't know everybody's viewpoint, but the stereotypical viewpoint, I guess, that comes from that is when you give examples like that. While it is something to be noted and pay attention to, if you start looking, it's like, well, that we need to have a certain diversity represented here. It always comes back to like, well, what's the merit, right? What are the qualifications of those people? Because at least to me, I think that would be more relevant to leading a military force is what is the capabilities of the people? What is their merit? And if there is a desire to have a greater diversity, it would seem to make sense that it should be more on your outreach approaches to maybe go look for the people that fit those categories that are qualified. But Brett, not necessarily.
That's what
the Air Force Academy does. I was
about to say that's what a lot of DEI initiatives looked at. So, for example, I won't name the company, but there was a Fortune 500 company that I had as a client, and one of their DEI initiatives was they did a study within their hiring and looked at the colleges that they recruited out of. Where in the country were they recruiting from? What colleges were they looking at? Did they go to job fairs, that were different universities frequented? And one of the things that their own internal study observed was they were very limited in the universities that they were recruiting out of. They didn't recruit out of HBCUs. They weren't even necessarily recruiting out of universities in the South and in areas where that may have more diverse populations. In the Northeast, they didn't have a lot of recruitment either. And so one of the quote unquote DEI initiative they did was just to expand the colleges they recruited from. They didn't change their hiring criteria. They didn't change, anything else that they were looking for. They just expanded like you said, the pool of people that they were recruiting from. But that was a DEI initiative, right?
Yeah,
because
and I think that's a good point.
At that.
And I think that's a good point, Thea, because that's part of the big discussion that goes on. Like we're talking, the affirmative action versus DEI, is that a lot of people confuse the two because they don't understand. You being a lawyer, get this, like where affirmative action, that is the legal standpoint. That is the laws that are around that. Whereas DEI is much more of a cultural initiative, right? It's how do you assess your corporate culture in addressing these things? Like you said, looking at our initiatives, where do we hire from, things like that. But a lot of the time the two get confused because of the kind of general approach to it. Because the examples that often come up with it are tied around the things to where, quotas may not necessarily be what's thrown out, but when you do have companies that adjust their practices and the workforce that comes in may be more diverse, but they're less capable, that's where the issue comes.
Based on what data? How are they less capable? I don't have
specific data from that. I'm relaying.
I have one specific example, and Okay, I'm libertarian, so I apologize, but I'm going to chuck a spear at the Democrat Party here. When Biden decided to run in 2020, he specifically said, "I'm going to pick a black female for my vice president," and he made that his number one criteria for who he picked as his running mate. And I think the past 4 or 5 years have showed us that Kamala Harris was not probably the best person for the job.
Based on what data? That, I mean, honestly, you're saying that these programs are in place and then they end up getting people that weren't qualified for the job. On paper, I really want you to. I mean, I'm kind of challenging you to tell me how Kamala Harris, who had served as the Attorney General for the state of California, has had a long legal career and had served in public office prior to, and then was a United States Senator elected from the largest populated state in our country, that somehow her resume was not analogous to any other vice president prior to her, that she didn't meet the qualifications to be vice president.
No.
Because your
But
argument has to be premised.
We all know that being on the ticket isn't just about your resume. Dan Quayle had an excellent resume as well, but that guy was also.
But what I asked you for was data to show that when you have these practices, the outcome is that less qualified people are being selected for the position. So I'm saying, well, what are you basing that on? What data is backing up that these less qualified people are in the job? So you're saying, well, Kamala Harris, because she was only picked because she was black. And my question is, well, tell me how she was less qualified. And I haven't heard that. I'm gauging that you have an opinion she wasn't a great vice president, but tell me how she was less qualified based on what we knew about her at the time that she was picked.
I guess what I will say is I don't know who else was being considered. So it's hard for me to know who to compare her against. But I will say from what we've discussed
I'll put you out of your
here,
misery a little bit. I think it's a bad example, Dion. Politics is, I think it's a bad example. What I'm asking for is, if you point to some type of study, some type of article that comes out that company X or university X, denied admission to these qualified people, and then the people that got in were unqualified.
I wasn't talking about these companies and everything. I was talking about the one statement made by Joe Biden saying my number one criteria is that I'm going to pick a black female, and he picked Kamala Harris, and her performance was poor.
To my question. My question was asking for data, coming back to what Brett said, right? Brett mentioned the perception is that because of these programs, you're lower, basically that standards are being lowered, and that lower quality people or unqualified people are now being put in roles that, and to the hindrance of whatever the organization that we're talking about, whether it be a school, whether it be a company, wherever. And I said, well, what data is that based on? And the example you're giving me is Joe Biden's selection of Kamala Harris. And I don't think it matches the question that I was asking, is what I'm saying.
Okay. No, that's fair. And I don't have that data. And I think the only thing that a lot of people have, right or left, is anecdotal. A lot of people will point to, say, like Delta Airlines aired a commercial that said that their number one concern was, DEI, that they wanted diversity and inclusion in their workforce. And then we started having a lot of, issues with airlines and stuff. But that's just anecdotal, right? There's no like hard data on that.
You're talking, when you say issues with airlines, are you referring to Boeing's planes?
No. Delta had some issues. Delta had that one plane that flipped upside down on landing. Delta also had the issue with their computers. There were a couple of things that happened, but
people make statements that are not helpful to the cause, right? I do tend to agree that Biden coming out and saying, no matter what, I'm choosing a black female, whether it's for vice president or as a Supreme Court justice, doesn't do us any favors. Like, it doesn't, the perception does not help us in that area. But what I will say, so specifically, at the academy, right? There was a lack of diversity in the student body. And exactly like Thea said, all they did was start recruiting from different areas. They didn't change. I mean, it is a serious mathematical algorithm to get your score, right? And race never comes into play with it. But when you recruit from, say, HBCUs, you're just increasing the diversity of your pool that you are then selecting from. The other issue that I would, none of that, by the way, is a quota. So the diversity of the student body at the Air Force Academy, the diversity goes up, but the standards didn't change at all. And then the other issue is at the academy, there was a diversity and inclusion office, like in headquarters, and it was, for things like they noticed that in essentially the basic training before the freshmen start, that way more women were quitting than men. Why? So that office was trying to figure out why women were quitting at higher rates than men during this event. In another instance, it was Native Americans are saying that they're being discriminated against, how they don't feel welcome at the academy, right? It had nothing to do with quotas, nothing to do with like, well, we're going to give this white guy's slot to someone else. Like, none of that stuff is happening. And unless you're talking about a strictly affirmative action case like Thea is discussing, like with Harvard, none of that stuff is going on anywhere. Like, I don't see how.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, like that's what I'm saying.
But the thing, I guess that's the thing. There's this, it feels like vibes. Like this, with the whole backlash to DEI, to me, just feels like vibes. There's this perception that suddenly white men are disadvantaged, and so and I keep saying, well, show me how is that happening? What is? Show me the data. And every time I ask for that, is there something that you're pointing to that beyond just vibes that shows that these programs were harmful? Because I can point to areas where they have improved. They have had positive outcomes, one of which was retention of women in the workforce, right? So a number of companies were having issues where you have a young female executive come into the workforce, in her 20s. And then at some point she has, as women start to have children, they leave the workforce. So they get all this training, companies invest all this money into them. And then at some point you start to see the attrition for women being much higher than men. Right. And so the companies feel like, hey, we're losing money on, we've trained these women. They have this experience, but yet they're leaving the workforce at a higher rate than men of their male counterparts are. And that's not good for the company, because they're like, look, we've invested in these workers. We want to retain them. So the question becomes, well, is there some reason that women are leaving the workforce? And what you found was a lot of companies were not accounting for the differences between how women, once they've had children and, being given proper maternity leave, being given the, different programming around, maybe giving them a rev back up period after they've had a child to come back into the workforce and rev back up. And so that they can, maybe go part-time for 6 months when they come back. And then after a year, they're back to full-time. Those types of programs they found to be more successful with helping to retain female employees. Those are DEI programs. Right. And it was never meant. And quite often now what we're seeing, especially when it comes to paternity leave, now you're seeing any parent can take, leave at a lot of these companies, right? They're offering it to both men and women. And I have very often encouraged my male clients to use those programs so that it will normalize men taking paternity leave. We saw it in the military. I think we were all on active duty when that became a thing, that men can take leave after the birth of their children. We're seeing it codified in laws, but all of that was these were DEI initiatives, right? And so I guess I don't see what's wrong with that. And I don't see how that harms certain people. I don't see how that comes at the expense of anybody else, or how that's changing the standard.
So Thea, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of this is vibes. And I'll give another example to tag on to what Will said about how there are certain statements that are made that don't help the cause. And I think when the videos came out of the LA fire chief saying that it was important that you see somebody that looks like you come to your house when you're in a fire to come pull you out. And like most of the nation kind of sat there and went, no, I just care that you're somebody who can carry me out of the burning building. Like those
Yeah.
kinds of statements, I think, are contributing to the vibe on the one side, who's like, why do you care about what somebody looks like? You should care about how well they do the job. And so I
that
think
was
you're
the same
absolutely
issue
right
with
in that this is very much about the vibes. And you might be right. Maybe it is about a large population of white males who suddenly feel disenfranchised when they're used to feeling like, they have all the options. Or maybe it's more. I don't know. But I would say that is probably hitting the nail on the head, that it is probably a lot more vibes than actual data.
And one thing I will agree, and I guess, man, I hesitate to actually say this, but I'm going to say it. I agree with Clarence Thomas in that he has spoken about this idea that when you talk about, I'm going to select a Black person because we need Black people in these roles, it then it actually has the opposite effect in that people then they discount the qualifications of that Black person, because their race was the thing that was put up in the forefront of their selection, right? And so that's one issue. Like Clarence Thomas has spoken about why he's very against affirmative action, and it seems like he's been very resentful in his own career that his credentials have not necessarily been respected or acknowledged because people assume that he was placed. He was the token choice, right? I would say the same. As far as Ketanji Brown Jackson, there was zero reason that Biden needed to say, I'm going to pick a Black female. I think he was trying to pander to the Democratic base because he knows Black women make up such a large part of the base. But I didn't need that to vote for him. And the minute he did it, I remember cringing because then I said, man, whatever woman gets chosen, then that's forever going to be people are going to question whether or not, she would have been chosen but for the fact that she was a Black woman. And if you look at Ketanji Brown Jackson's, if you look at Justice Jackson's background and you look at her qualifications, they're impeccable. And I think had he never made that comment, she could have still been chosen and should have still been chosen because she had a legal career that set her up to be a Supreme Court nominee, right? In the same way that you can argue for better or worse Gorsuch or Kavanaugh or, Amy Coney Barrett or whoever, right? They all on paper have done the work. Their careers have been such that they would be at the level would they be considered for those positions.
And Thea,
I agree with you.
I think what you're saying, Thea, is actually something that's very valid to the entire discussion in terms of the concept of vibes and how people feel about it. Because when those type of comments are made, it shows an underlying mentality about the whole concept, right? Because again, if we were solely basing things on merit and qualifications, why does someone even need to make a comment around, I'm going to choose someone based on color, race, gender, whatever, right? It doesn't matter. So the fact that you even have to say that you're going to make a choice based on that, that's the underlying concern about the whole thing.
I think that the reason you see those kind of comments made is because it's also acknowledging the lack of that in all these years we've never given somebody the opportunity to that has these particular identities to serve in these roles, right? So I think there's this idea that it's time, give someone the opportunity to give them the opportunity to shine, right?
Well, does it matter if
that
you're giving them the opportunity or that they've earned the opportunity?
Yeah, but there's plenty of people who earn the opportunity that never, they never got the interview, right? So a lot of what I think, if I'm arguing devil's advocate, the issue is there are times when people, I guess here's the opposite side of this whole argument, right? That you've had for generations qualified people that have been excluded because of their identities, right? And so now the idea was to look at, okay, what barriers have we put in place? Or if we've been working off of a system that benefited certain groups to the exclusion of others, and what can we do to try to counteract that? Right. And part of that is saying, well, like, okay, let's look at it. We've had how many hundred years of Supreme Court justices, and prior to Ketanji Brown Jackson, we've had two black men and then no black women, despite all the history that we of our country, and and so I guess the idea is, like, it feels overdue, right? Justice Sotomayor is still the first Latina to sit on the court. I don't think we've ever had an Asian justice or somebody who has identified with an Asian background, right? And Korematsu is still good law, and you can't help but wonder if you ever had people sitting on the court, or when you have people sitting on the court who themselves know they would be victims to some of these rulings, then maybe they look at those laws differently, and they look at how we interpret the laws differently, right? The fact that Korematsu is still good law is ridiculous. And for those who are not familiar with that case, it was a Supreme Court case that found that the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II, they found that to be the case found that was a valid suspension of habeas corpus. And most legal scholars in hindsight say that case was decided wrong, and it flies in the face of the 14th Amendment, yet it's still on the books as good law. So those are the kinds of things that people bring up as far as the makeup of the court specifically.
So for Brett and Dion, if those statements did not help the cause, right? But if they had said, all things being equal, I'm choosing a black woman. If I've got two equally qualified, a white man and a black woman, how would you feel if they had just said, all things being equal?
Here's how I think you could phrase it better and get a better win out of it. You say, historically, we have ignored these parts of society that are producing fantastic performers in this area, whatever it is. I am going to make sure that those people have the opportunity to compete. And then when you pick the person that you pick, you go, guess what? We looked at all of the exceptional candidates across the board, and this was the most exceptional candidate. That's what you say, right? Whatever happened behind closed doors, that's fine. But what you say publicly is, we looked across everybody, and fine, yes, Ketanji Brown Jackson is a black woman, but she was the most qualified candidate against everybody that we matched her up against.
But that's what you said. But that's how DEI programs function. That's how they were functioning in corporate America, right? It was never about changing the criteria or the standards. And this is where, where it's so frustrating to me, right? And I'm a black woman who went to the Air Force Academy, who has a law degree, who works at a big law firm, and still has had, so like, for example, affirmative action was outlawed in the state of California in the 1990s, right? It's in the California Constitution that affirmative action was not permitted in the state of California, as blue as we are. And when I was in law school, I had a person look me in the eye and tell me that, oh, well, we don't, I know for you, you had it in your favor as far as the admissions process that you were black. That was something that, you had an advantage over me who was white. And I was like, in what admissions process? What are you talking about? And so even when you get rid of these programs, there's, like I said, there's always this perception that these things are somehow giving Black people or people who, check whatever box some advantage, and that's the only qualifications that got us these jobs. And that's where I am resentful of it, right? And but what DEI programs were looking to do was to say, we're going to keep the standards. The standards are what they are, but looking at what are all the things that we do that don't allow us to consider or provide the same opportunities to people, either in the workplace, in our recruiting, and our retention, and our promotions, all these kinds of things. Like, for example, another company I work for, one of the criteria, so maybe I would say this was where they changed their criteria, but one of the criteria they were looking for when they were talking about like putting people on this like executive track, right? This was a banking client. They were really like putting a lot of weight towards like time, like extracurricular activities, right? How much time you spent doing things outside of work, right? And it wasn't necessarily, and they were putting this under like client development, but they were only accounting for certain things, basically like FaceTime, but not like how often are you calling and trying to bring clients in? How often are you trying to like develop marketing and do things that are going to bring clients in? That wasn't necessarily getting credited, but what was getting credited is like, oh, did you take somebody golfing? Did you do this and do that? But it didn't account for like special need. Like, so you have like, certain employees didn't necessarily have the ability to do that, right? If you have a disability, you're not playing golf, right? But you could be doing other things that are included in client development, right? If you're a single parent, you probably don't necessarily have the same freedom to go do stuff on the weekends with clients, but there's certain things you could be doing. So one of the things that client looked at was, do we need to broaden how we're defining client development so that we're not excluding certain people who just don't have the ability to do client development in one way? Are there multiple ways and the outcome is the same? Because what we're looking for is, how are they developing business for this company? That was a DEI initiative. It was. And it was looking at, are there certain people who have skills that we want to promote in this company, but because of the way we're defining our criteria, we're excluding them? And I think that is the issue, is that it's never been a real discussion about what DEI actually was. The idea that you're erasing the Tuskegee Airmen off the Air Force website because of quote unquote DEI, that left me speechless. And we've heard over and over again, oh, well, all that the current administration is correcting DEI hires. What does that mean? I don't understand what that means. And how do you know if someone's a DEI hire? What criteria was used to determine that someone was a DEI hire, other than they may fit a protected category?
Is it if somebody says that the person's going to be a DEI hire?
Because outside of Biden, I don't think, I've not seen, that outside of the political arena where people were announced as being chosen because they, I'm going to go hire a Black CEO, I'm going to go hire a Hispanic, CFO for my company, or I have not seen that. And so, and especially with government, was that something that we were seeing in government that now that's somehow being quote unquote undone? I don't know. I don't understand how you undo something.
But I do think that's where like the Boeing statement, when Boeing says my number one priority is diversity, and then they start having a bunch of, Delta, and then starting to have a bunch of crashes, the common refrain is, well, maybe you should focus on, good pilots and safe flying. And it's not, I don't think Delta would ever they're obviously not like, diversity is our number one, and we could care less about good pilots, right? But that's the message.
It's out of good faith. One of the things I remember when the pilot of the helicopter that crash had happened in DC, one of the first things that was coming out was DEI about the qualifications of the pilots, and I was like, well, how do we know? Why is that the first thing we're going towards, right? And then it's like, but if it comes out that the pilot is white and is a male, then there's no question of their qualifications anymore. That's where I'm like, well, if we're going to have the discussion about the individual's qualifications, but why is it assumed if it had been
the news around here in DC was reporting, like, they kept the identity of the helicopter pilot, unknown for a while. They kept it from the public. And then when they finally did release it, a bunch of anonymous sources were saying that the reason why they kept it quiet was because it was a female pilot, and they knew that they would get backlash about it being a DEI hire or whatever.
It was sad because I knew her identity relatively quickly because I'm in Facebook groups for military female officers and stuff like that. So very quickly, people who knew her were kind of talking about what you just said, that this idea that because she was a woman, that would be seen as she wasn't qualified. And to me, that causes more harm. The idea that anybody who is a minority in some way, that by virtue of that being part of their identity, that we're assuming that they weren't qualified for their job, that is, I think that's harmful. And I don't understand what that's being based on.
And for our listeners and viewers, like as someone who's given and taken flying check rides, like there's no race and gender have no, like there is no case where I would be giving someone a check ride and be like, well, they didn't do that great, but they're a girl, so I'm going to pass them, or whatever. Like that's just not how like flying check rides and that's not how your qualifications work in the flying world.
Yeah. So something that kind of seems like to me with this whole thing, it almost just seems like there's a lot of virtue signaling on either side that we start throwing out these terms.
I'll give you that.
Right. Because, I mean, we're looking at information and data around these cases, and we're all kind of in agreement that, yeah, companies and universities, all these places should bring people into their environments based on merit. And yes, it makes sense to expand the pool that you look at to find the most qualified applicants, regardless of where they come from, right? That just makes sense. But then you start getting these terms thrown out in terms of DEI and, whether the right is against DEI and the left is for DEI. It all just kind of seems one way or another. It's a matter of, I don't know, trying to spin something up to create that division again in some capacity. Because if in practice, companies are not doing the things that they're accused of doing, well, then there doesn't seem to really be an issue. So then it's like, okay, is it an education problem to where the people are just simply misinformed about what the initiatives actually are and what the intentions were? At least from this conversation, that's kind of what I'm pulling from it.
And I think that's what the left is saying, is that there's nothing wrong with DEI programs the way that they're currently being implemented. By and large, like there are no issues. The things that the right is fearful that's happening is not happening. And here's the one, I'll play devil's advocate just a little bit. And here's the one thing I'll give you. For every hour or whatever that someone is spending on making sure that the work environment is welcoming and not discriminatory and whatever, they're not thinking, how can I make this place better for white men? I'll give you that.
I disagree. I guess I disagree with that. And because I think that when you have a total workforce where people feel that they can be their authentic selves, that includes white men, right? So DEI was never exclusive of white males. It depends on the workforce. It depends on the company, right? You like male nurses. I've seen initiatives that are looking at how do we increase the number of male nurses, because you have a nursing shortage right now, right? And so you literally have schools, universities and hospitals and stuff saying, how do we encourage more men to get into this field? Because you have, this huge part of the population that's not going into this profession, yet we have a shortage of people in this profession, right? So yeah, a lot of times it's still going to be based on whatever the needs of X organization is, right? But that's just not what's getting the attention, and that's why it's hard because, and like I said, my job is to defend discrimination cases, right? Like I'm normally the one sitting here, working, representing an employer who is, being sued by employees, who's saying that they have been mistreated in whatever way. And I have had white male plaintiffs, like I have, and so, and those same laws protected their rights, right? I have had to defend companies. I've had at least, I've had several now. I will say a number of our white male plaintiffs have brought cases under this disability, under the Americans with Disabilities Act or California's version of that. But I've had at least two where it was national origin or race, right? And it was a white male saying that they were being treated differently as their similarly situated counterparts. One involved a company that seemed to be favoring foreign workers, bringing in people, from India. So his argument was that the management, was favoring and bringing in people from India versus hiring, Americans, and specifically didn't like hiring white males. That was the case. I had to defend it, and those laws are on the books, and they covered his status as a white male. That was the protected category that he was saying he was being discriminated based on. And it was no different than the cases where I've dealt with black employees saying that they were being discriminated against. So my whole point is,
one of the
go on
to maybe talk about where 51% of the country may be coming from, that whatever that percentage is that voted for Donald Trump this past year. Maybe we should look at equity, because I think that's what a lot of people, I remember over the past 4 years or so, there was a lot of discussion in the media about the difference between equity and equality. 4 or 5 years ago, I would have heard the term equity or equality and just in my mind made them the same word, right? But then it became a thing that, no, these are very different things. Equality is that you give people the same opportunity, and equity is regardless of where they started, you give them the same endpoint. And I would say that is probably going to be the biggest heartburn for probably most of the people who are against these DEI initiatives, is that they at least perceive that and this goes back to the whole merit-based thing, right? They're perceiving that people who did not meet the initial qualifications to get to the endpoint are being given a, here's your pass, go, and $200 to get to the endpoint, even though you didn't earn it. So
yeah, but Dion, I think even that is, I think the word that you're missing is the opportunity to end up at the same endpoint, not a guaranteed endpoint. And I think that's the difference. If two people who start at different places and you're just saying, well, I'm going to guarantee that they end up at the same place, yeah, that would be an issue. But that's the vibe that that the right seems to have, that we're going to guarantee that whatever, Ketanji Brown Jackson becomes a Supreme Court justice, even though she wasn't, it's the opportunity to still be successful. We're going to remove the historic barriers that had been in place that prevented someone from being as equally successful as, say, a white male.
I mean, so for example, one study that they did in law firms, they created a fake writing sample and resume, right? And the writing sample, it was the exact same writing sample, but they just changed like one was Tyrone, versus Timothy, so Timothy Jackson versus Tyrone Jackson, same writing sample, same almost identical resumes, and they circulated it, and they had lawyers grade the writing sample, and universally the writing sample for Tyrone was more harshly graded and found to be, the feedback was that it was not up to par, and then the one for Timothy received higher ratings, even though it was the exact same writing sample. So a lot of times what a lot of these DEI programs were trying to acknowledge is that there is still implicit bias that people have. And they were trying to say, well, how do we address these biases? A lot of the education and training was really about acknowledging that you may be biased and trying to check your bias at the door. Right? That, do you think, because there are employers, I've heard it, well, women, when you hire them, you only have them for a few years before they get pregnant and they're going to leave you. Well, that's a bias, right? And it's like, okay, a lot of it was about trying to have the discussions to try to create that equity of opportunity for different workers so that they're not being excluded, right? It was never about saying that the outcome had to be equal. And I agree with Will there, but that's definitely the perception that I think when you hear people criticize DEI is this idea that the outcome was just putting people in place so that we can say, oh, look, we are correcting, years of inequality by just promoting these Black people or promoting these women or promoting X, Y, and Z just because. And that's created that perception. But again, I don't see the data to back that up. And that's where but what I will say, the last thing I'll say, or not the last thing, but one thing I really want to emphasize, I have seen no shortage of problematic, racist, sexist, terrible behavior in the workplace in cases that I've worked over the last 7 or 8 years. And quite often they're much more the traditional, thing that, you would think of, where you have, unfortunately, still maybe, male workers sexually harassing women, creating hostile work environments for these same groups that supposedly are propped up by DEI. I've much more often still seen just racist, obnoxious behavior going on in workplaces than I have seen the reverse, as far as the kinds of cases that I've had to defend, and definitely when I've come in to do investigations for companies. So I guess the last thing, or I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I think one of the things that I hear from the right is this idea that we had achieved racial equality, that there's no more discrimination and racism is solved and misogyny is solved and these problems don't exist anymore. So we don't need initiatives to address them, because the real victims now are the fact that we've overcorrected for it. And that has not been my experience as an employment attorney, as far as the types of things I see. And again, I'm the one defending the companies when those accusations are being made and those types of lawsuits are being brought.
So to Thea's point, so when you've got two essays by Tyrone and Timothy, the equity solution was that we masked their names so that they each had the opportunity to receive the same score on the essay. It wasn't changing the merits or whatever. It was to give them both the same opportunity to get the same score, considering it's the same writing. We just masked their names. And I don't see, that's the kind of thing we're talking about when we're talking about equity, but it's the same just with whether it's DEI fully or just equity versus equality. It's the vibe that people get from, and in my opinion, it's like, well, this is what I want to believe, so I'm just going to believe it. There's a victim mentality, I think, on the part of white men, which I am one, that comes into play.
Well, the other thing, as far as data, I also always push back on, if DEI had somehow overcorrected for the historical imbalances or inequities, then how come we still see the same overwhelmingly the majority of C-suite individuals in these large companies are still white males, right? So, but if DEI was keeping white men down, how come they're still in all these positions of power in the workplace, supervisory roles? And I don't understand, if DEI was this negative thing, then how come the outcomes aren't actually showing that you have some type of shortage of white men in power?
The counter arguments can be because the white men just worked super hard to make sure that they stayed in power.
But that means the DEI programs weren't working then, right? If that's what they were designed to do, was to disenfranchise white men.
Look,
so were they ever a threat then?
I know that to some of our audience, maybe this sounds a little bit tone deaf lately, but I really would like us to get to the point where a person's skin color is about as remarkable as a person's eye color, right? Like, we don't talk about how many blue-eyed people are employed by company X or how many, brown-eyed people got into Harvard, right? Because we just don't care. And I know that probably our audience will be like, well, he's naive and maybe he's a closet racist because he's like, oh, I don't want to see color. But I mean, genuinely, wouldn't it be nice to live in a society where we don't look at a person's skin color and automatically make judgments about that person? What, Thea, being the one Black person on this podcast, what judgments should we make about you just by looking at you, right? Like, it's absurd.
I agree, but I'm not a proponent of colorblindness, because I know that my race and my gender in particular have informed my lived experience. And I don't like the idea when we look at what happened with General, why is his name blanking, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Millie CQ Brown.
CQ Brown,
yeah.
right? That it seems as though he was let go simply because he did a video in which he acknowledged his lived experience, right? And our lived experiences are our lived experiences, right? And if I could sit here for a very, I always say it was harder for me to be Black at the Air Force Academy than it was for me to be a woman. And I was there at the peak of the sexual assault scandal. Yet I dealt with far more horrible things based on my race, right? And that's part of my story. And that informed how I came into the military. It informed how I mentored troops. I always made it a point to connect with all of my troops and have them get to know me, because I found a lot of my enlisted, I was the first Black person they have ever really known, right? Because people come from different parts of the country, and I took it upon myself to say, I want people to know me as a person and get to know me, and then maybe I can help expand what their view of Black people was in general. But I don't know if I was motivated to do that because of the experiences that I had with racism at the academy, right? So our lived experiences inform who we are and how we walk through the world. And I don't think we can just ignore that.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, you can't ignore whatever racism and discrimination and different treatment that you have already received. But it would be nice if, like, your kids just didn't receive that, right? If their lived experience had nothing to do with the color of their skin and had everything to do with just their experiences as human beings. I know that's utopic for me to say, but
it is.
And I want a couple $1 million, but
well, I mean, here's the thing. I agree with you, and I wish that were the case. But one thing I've always found fascinating is if you have a conversation, and this is specifically to race, right? Most Black people can say, oh, if you ask them, when did you realize you were Black, and that meant something different for you? And a lot of times, like most people's story is going to be, well, when I was in kindergarten, or when I was 4 or 5, or this thing happened to me, and I suddenly was like, oh, the world sees me in this way because of the color of my skin, right? But then when I ask white people the same thing, it's always interesting, because it's a very interesting conversation. I love to have it, of like, when did you realize that you being white meant something and what that meant? And a lot of times people either can't answer the question, or they really struggle because it's not something they've even had to think about. And that's such a different lived experience. And I do think it's important for us to have the ability to have the conversation. And what I don't like with the backlash to DEI is now it seems to be, if you acknowledge that we have different lived experiences, that somehow means that you are, being divisive. And then that means really what you're telling certain people is they can't tell their story, because it makes other people feel bad that their story may have these adversities as part of it. And to me, that's ridiculous any more than someone who grew up in poverty and that's part of their story is how they overcame poverty, right? Or had a disability and how they have lived with their disability. I just want us to be able to, not us as a society, to have those differences and be able to openly talk about them and share them and live out loud in that way.
I mean, Dion, that the essay thing that we were just talking about, you couldn't even see skin color. You made people, not you, but like, the graders made assumptions based on people's names,
Yeah.
I'm absolutely positive that I have been discriminated against because of my first name on essays.
I told you I thought you were Black before I met you, because I saw your name first. I was shocked. I was shocked the first time you walked in. And at the time you were still with your ex-wife, and she's like, oh yeah, this is my husband Dion. And I was like, oh, I thought that I knew a Black man was getting ready to walk in the room. And I was like, who was that?
Sorry to disappoint.
So yeah.
All right. I think we're getting pretty long on time here, but maybe if we were to summarize, it sounds like the four of us pretty much agree that most of the issue with DEI in this country seems to revolve around what each side has been sort of fed as the talking points and the narrative about how they should feel about DEI. Maybe it's more problematic on the right, as in they've been kind of told DEI is this evil thing. But I think on the left, it like you guys have been espousing many of the great things about DEI initiatives, and there certainly are. I think anybody listening to us to say that there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no misogyny anymore in this country, they would be deceiving themselves. And so having programs that try to address, even though those things are illegal, things still happen. And so having programs that try to counter that without having to sue everybody would be a good thing. So but I think a lot of people on the left kind of go, well, we're just trying to make the world a better place, and what's wrong with this? I'm not saying that it, like, can we guarantee that it's never been abused? Like DEI has never been used to go, you know what? Like I'm going to make sure that we get more of these people in, or I'm going to stick it to whoever. I don't know. I don't want to start that conversation this late into the podcast, but both sides have that narrative of this is what we're doing, this is what we're against, and everything. And I think the four of us kind of looking at the data that we have, looking at the articles that we've read and everything, it seems like we can all agree that in spirit, at least, trying to give historically disadvantaged people the opportunity to compete is a good thing.
I think so, but I think I'll one thing that I think you left out of your summary that I do think is important that we talked about was the value signaling, and that I do think that DEI has been used, in a negative way to value signal things on the left, and then that has been used as a weapon by the right to say, aha, you see, we told you. So I agree with that it because I don't think it was ever in good faith, to sit up here and necessarily say I'm just going to pick a black, my promise is I will pick a black female Supreme Court justice. I never liked that, and so I agree that that's problematic, and it feeds into why people have the perception of DEI that they do, and that I don't think that's a good thing. And I agree that it's harmful. It's more harmful than it was ever positive or have positive outcomes.
So something else I want to kind of throw in here before we wrap up. This is not to add on to the conversation per se, to carry it forward, because I feel like it could very easily. But we didn't necessarily talk about the cultural aspects of DEI and how a lot of the initiatives were to bring awareness of a different cultures within the workplace and make that a part of the workplace, that you had to bring all of these external social factors into the workplace to make it fully inclusive for everybody to feel that they could work there. And I think that's part of the issue too, is because you're trying to make your job place look exactly like everywhere else. And I don't always know if that's a good idea, because I don't know. To me, there's a big difference between the concept of multiculturalism versus kind of like a multi-ethnic standpoint. Like, I know we use skin color a lot in that instance, but for me, when you talk about ethnicity, that's not just a skin color thing. It's a lot of also the backgrounds of the people. But when you start talking about multiculturalism, it turns more into an issue, because you get this idea of, instead of being, the American dream of, e pluribus unum, is that, out of many, we have one. You kind of get this e pluribus pluribus kind of thing going, where it's out of many, we have many. And you start getting a lot of division that way, because you're not coming to a standpoint where people have shared values and shared purpose. And I think that is also a big piece of what's causing this division, is we have these additional values that are being injected into the workplace that don't really have anything to do with the work being done. And like I said, I'm not trying to spin up a whole concept. This is just more of like maybe giving our listeners something to think about along with this topic. Because I think that's part of the heartburn that a lot of the folks on the right have, is they're seeing a lot of these initiatives that are being pushed in, and we see a lot of values that are going against what people stand for.
Brett, I think you may have just introduced a topic that we should discuss is what is American culture and what does that mean to when we're talking about American culture, because I think, the right and the left, have these different definitions of patriotism and what does it mean to be American. When we talk about making America great again, what does all of these things mean? But it's tied to culture. And I think you make a very keen point of some of the resistance that you see is this fear of the loss of however people define American culture. And if we're changing that, are we, I think some people feel threatened by that, that they're losing something that's important to them.
Because if you change the culture, are we still America? There's that whole idea.
So the only thing I've got on that is like, if having a Black History Month or an LGBTQ month in your workplace makes those groups feel included and seen and welcome. The reason that I would like, if white people weren't like, well, where's the White History Month? Like, obviously, having a month or feeling included or feeling seen is important to white people, just like it is for Black people. So I find it difficult to like, how can you tell whatever group, LGBTQ, how could you tell them you don't need your own month at work? Like, just keep that shit out of here, while at the same time saying, where's the White History Month? Like, you can't feel excluded.
Yeah. And I think some of it is that we are what we celebrate, right? And I think that's a quote I always say, we are what we celebrate. And, throughout historically, it seems like we have been okay celebrating certain figures that tended to be white and if not male. And so I think where you saw the rise of a lot of these, months in African, I know definitely Black History Month there was a lack of acknowledgement of the contributions of Black Americans throughout our history. And so that's kind of what the origin of that came from. And then you saw other groups saying, well, what about us? Does that detract from other cultures, or does it just allow us to see how all the ways in which these different groups of people have contributed to the story of America?
Well, I
But
mean,
how
my
much
thought would
does
be
that belong in the world? Yeah.
To do like what you're talking about with DEI anyway is okay. Then let's just look at the broader pool of people that we can celebrate and celebrate them at any time. And you don't have to have a specific called out area to do that. You just celebrate greatness regardless of where it came from. Right.
Yeah.
And my thought would be too is, why does that necessarily have to be part of the workplace environment where it can just be part of our American culture to where we celebrate greatness all the time? So
I think where I've heard a lot of complaint from my extended family who are MAGA is not that there is like a Black History Month or that there's like an LGBT month or something, but that recently it has coincided with an attack on parts of our history that have been mythological, right? Like the tearing down of a statue of Thomas Jefferson or defacing of, George Washington or, those kinds of figures where it's like, look, they weren't perfect, but man, they sure did a lot of good things to stand up this nation. Like, okay, let's acknowledge the bad, but when I think what it is it's the simultaneous, we're going to promote this over here and we're also going to tear down this. I think that's the part that has gotten a lot of people that I know really incensed about it.
I think what I find frustrating when I hear, because I've heard the whole issues with like, especially Thomas Jefferson, I think in particular, right? And it's like, there seems to be a resentment that if somebody says, well, you know what, I don't see that man as a hero because despite the good things he did, he was a child molester who owned human beings, right? And those seem to be objective facts of what we know of history, at least with Sally Hemings. She was 13 years old, at the time that he had, I think, his first child with her, things like that. So for some people, they don't want to say, like, it's like, I don't care what good you did beyond that. That's a deal breaker for some people. And I think that's a difficult thing for us to engage with as part of our history, right? But that doesn't mean you can't have the discussion. It is what it is. Like some people are, for them, they're going to say, I don't care. It's hard for me to celebrate someone that I know had these moral failings. Right. And then for other people, but they're like, but I value the Declaration of Independence and everything that it stood for, even if the person writing it didn't necessarily live the truth of the words on the paper. Right. But I think that's a valid discussion to be had, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And it's not always, I mean, on the Democratic side, you know, we used to have Jefferson Jackson dinners and you'll be hard pressed to find a Jefferson Jackson dinner these days. Now it's Kennedy King or you know, some other historical figures because of the acknowledgement of some of those issues that Thea is talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm just saying that. But people can choose. I agree with that. People can choose where their lines are of how you celebrate it. I think there's a difference, though. You know, there are plenty of American presidents that, you know, yeah, if we want to say infidelity is a moral line that people think, hey, I can't look at you the same if you're not faithful based on how I believe, then okay, that's up to them, right? And I think I'm okay with that, right? Like I'm okay with allowing people to not have to feel forced to celebrate these historical figures in these false ways, right? Because I think the frustration, you know, from Dion's perspective, is these are people who we grew up to be, that were heroes, but to some of us, I'm like, why am I supposed to see someone who owned slaves and did these things, you know, that to my ancestors is my, you know, and to people who lived in this country at the time, why am I told I have to see them as a hero because they had great works, you know? R. Kelly made really good music, but you know what I mean? But he's still a terrible, you know, it's like, I'm still a terrible person. I'm sorry. And people are always like, well, we're not going to listen to R. Kelly anymore. I'm like, yeah, I know what he was singing about. Like, it is what it is. Like, sometimes it's an uncomfortable, and everybody has to kind of choose where they fall on that, you know?
Yeah, so Thea, I think you're right. This is a discussion that we probably should have around American culture and what that stands for, because I think that is probably one of the largest roots of our political disagreements is what we think America actually is and should be.
I agree with that.
So
I agree with that.
All right. Well,
but I don't look forward to like that. That's a hard, like not a hard discussion, but like it's so
it's very broad.
Ephemeral, it's so conceptual. Like, how do you put that into words?
Well, but we had that same point with this discussion, right? When we're talking about the vibe, the feeling, you know, around DEI and everything that's there, that kind of plays into it. But I think that's a big point that we have to make when we do have that discussion is if we get to a point where we don't have the same common purpose and common values, we're not going to succeed as a united, like one nation. We're going to end up failing as competing tribes, you know, and that's again where America, it's always been said, America won't be taken down from the outside, we'll fall from within. And the farther we get from having those common values and purposes, that's the stuff that's going to happen. So while it is nebulous, I think it's a discussion that really needs to be had.
I agree with you.
All right. So next week, and you're leading it.
Okay. Well, you.
It's all good. All right, guys. Well, that's going to wrap us up for this week. I think it was a good discussion. Hopefully there's a lot of thinking points that are here. You know, very, very, very rarely do we come out of these conversations with an absolute solution. We do this so that people can continue to have that critical thought process where they start thinking about what they think about. You know, it's one of the things I love about being human, right? Is you have the ability to think about what you think about and why it's in your mind to start with. And so hopefully, again, that our disagreements are fueling our discussions are fueling, goodness, I'm messing this all up today.
Our disagreements inform your decisions.
There we go. Yeah. So
Brett, you're not closing us out before discussing what's been making us happy, are you?
No, I'm getting there. That's what I was getting into. So I was just kind of wrapping up the actual talk part first. But for our listeners, just in case you wonder, I'm operating on minimal hours of sleep running into this podcast, even still after we postponed today. So life with family. But let's go ahead and run around the room and see what's making us happy. Will, we'll go and start with you.
Yeah. So I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that we are recording this on Memorial Day. Not that that's necessarily making me happy, but it just to have a time kind of set aside that we take to remember the folks that have given their life, and as a so I previously flew C-130s in the Air Force, and unfortunately, we've lost a decent number of C-130s, both within the Air Force and the C-130 variants outside the Air Force, and largely fighting wildfires are some of the ones that are kind of on my mind today. So it's not necessarily making me happy, but that's what's on my mind, and I'm just I am glad that we have a kind of a day set aside for that.
Okay, Dion.
So the viewers probably have seen this around my neck. I've got this black strap around my neck, and it's because my arm here is in a sling, and I'm not necessarily happy about the surgery itself and the pain that I've been in for the past week, but I am pretty happy about the fact that we live in a time where the issues that I was having with my shoulder could be diagnosed and treated with modern medicine. My recovery seems to be going really well. I'm glad that I have a job that allowed me to work from home for a few days, so I didn't have to take a bunch of time off of work. And I have a wife who's able to work from home and was able to sort of help me out while I was at home without a working arm. So I'm just really grateful this week that I am blessed with the ability to have a medical procedure and be able to recover from it. And I know not everybody has that opportunity. So that's what's been making me happy this week.
Very cool.
So when we get off, I'm getting ready to pack because I'm flying out to the Air Force Academy this week to go to graduation. It will be the first time that I'm going to an Air Force Academy graduation that was not my own. And I'm happy that I'm going because the person who's graduating is the nephew to one of my best friends. And when I was at the academy, he was a small child, and my best friend's sister used to come to volleyball games and things, and would bring her kids. And one of the kids was this young man named Andrew. And that's kind of how he learned about the academy. And all these years later, he ended up going there, and he's graduating this week. So it makes me feel old that I remember him as a little kid running around on the campus. It's not that I've even stayed close to him per se. I mean, his mom and his aunt, are the people that I'm close to, his parents and stuff. But I just watching him grow up and now see that he, because when they first said, "Oh, Andrew now wants to be like you and go to the academy," I'm like, "Oh, that's so cute." And now he's about to be a second lieutenant, and he's going to commission. He got a pilot slot. And
nice.
it's just really cool to see who he's going to become. And so, my best friend was like, "Hey, you should come out for graduation." I was like, "You know what? I think I will," because I think it's something worth celebrating, and that's making me happy. So.
Are you going to wear your mess dress?
No. I know.
Your graduation dress.
Would it fit? I don't even think it would fit at this point. I haven't put that on in like 10 years. And so so no, I don't think, I'm not commissioning him or anything. I'm not pinning him on. So I don't think I'm pulling out a uniform. But I'll be so glad to just be there. And it's always a good time, to see them when they're graduating and, see the Thunderbirds fly over. To me, like, I get chills every time I see it. So,
who's the guest speaker, Thea?
I didn't look it up. I don't know. I should look that up. I'll have
Trump was at West Point.
Oh, so it's not Trump then?
It's not Trump. I don't know who it's going to be. So? I really hope that's what I was thinking. I hope it's not. I'd rather hear Vance speak than, I had Rumsfeld. He wasn't the most entertaining speaker. I was so mad. Like, at least George W. Bush was like giving people high fives the year before, and then at my year it was Rumsfeld, and he was very dry. And then 2 years later it was Obama, and like I'm still mad about that because he too was like super engaging. So I think the presidents tend to be the best ones, no matter who the president is. So I don't know. I'll look to see who it's going to be. You know.
Well, very cool. Well, I'll go ahead and wrap us up
Yeah.
here. So for me, mine's kind of simple. Part of my exhaustion from this last weekend was hosting my son's 10th birthday. So my oldest is now in double digits. So we're entering kind of a new phase of life with that. But it was just really cool to celebrate. And we had a chance to do it actually a little bit early. His birthday's not till next month, a few weeks out yet. But one of his friends, his dad is military, and he's actually getting ready to head out to Edwards Air Force Base. And so we moved the party up so that his friend could attend. And it was just great getting to see them play together and build that relationship. And part of his birthday, we got him a new watch, a smartwatch. And so he'll be able to now communicate with his friend who's going to be across the country. And again, it's just fun watching the kids grow up and see that kind of next generation, right, Thea, the next generation follow through and step into that next phase. It's always good.
Yeah.
But all right, guys, with that, we'll wrap it up for tonight. So again, like, subscribe, share with your friends. And again, please comment on our episodes. We really would like to know what you think. If you guys have a topic you want us to discuss, please throw that out there. We'd love to involve you guys in our discussions as well from that standpoint. So with that, guys, we will head on out, and guess we'll be back next week talking about American culture.
All right. Bye.